Simplifying negative square roots. I also have a series of videos on how to simplify just normal old positive square roots, and if that's a skill you're still working on, I highly recommend you watch those videos, and I'll link them in the description. We know that we can simplify the square root of -1 by writing it as just the letter I, and that's a notational choice we've made. But sometimes I have other negative numbers as my square roots. If I have the square root of -4, I can simplify that. And the first step in simplifying any negative square root is that we break it into -1 times the positive part. So -4 can be written as -1 times 4. Any negative number can be rewritten as a positive number times -1. So then I can break that up into the square root of -1 times the square root of 4. Square root of -1 is I. Square root of positive 4 is 2, because 4 is a perfect square. And if you're having trouble remembering what the perfect squares are, I'll link a video about that in the description as well. And we have a convention that we always put the other number first in front of the I if it's an integer. So even though this is the same idea, I'm going to rewrite it as 2I, just like I would write 2x if I had the variable rather than x2. So -4 simplifies into 2I, because square root of positive 4 simplifies to 2, and the square root of -1 simplifies to I. Of course, not all numbers are perfect squares. If I have something like the square root of -2, I'll start the same way. Break that into the square root of -1 times 2. And break those into their separate square roots. So I have the square root of -1 and then a positive square root. And in this case, I know the square root of 2 is an irrational number and cannot be simplified further. And if you're not sure how to tell that, please look at my video on simplifying square roots that I've linked in the description. And so this becomes just I times root 2. And because this is still under a square root, I have it after the I, like this. And that's so it's easier to tell whether or not this is under the square root, because it's very easy with square roots if I start writing stuff over here for it to be really unclear if I've written 2I or if I've written 2I. And it matters. So because of that, because that would be the square root of -1. And so because this is confusing, because a lot of times it'll be 2I like that, and you're like, which of these is it? This, is it this? That's why we put it here, because that way it's super clear this is not under the square root and this is. We don't have this problem with a 2, but we do have that problem with a root 2. So that's just a convention that we'll put this in front if there's a square root symbol, and we'll put it after if there is not. So let's look at one slightly more complicated example, and that is the square root of -12. It starts the same way as all of the other ones. Square root of -1 times 12. Break those into their own square roots. Square root of -1 times the square root of 12. This is I, root 12. But am I done? I mean, this is not a perfect square. I know my perfect squares go 4, 9, 16. 12 is between 9 and 16, so it's definitely not a perfect square. But I can write this with a perfect square in it because 12 can be written as 3 times 4. And I'm actually going to write it as 4 times 3 just because I know where I'm going, but it wouldn't be wrong to do it the other way. And the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 3 is just going to have to stay. And in this case, I have both a number that isn't under a square root and a number that is under a square root when I'm done. So I'm going to reorder this as 2i root 3. And that makes it super clear neither of these is under the square root. And I have whatever number I have here that's a real number in front of my I, and then my I, and then the square root. And this is the format so that we're consistent that we write these in when they're fully simplified. And if you want more information on this simplification process, please see my video about simplifying square roots.